Welcome to this Government 365 webinar with Tim Groser on the geopolitical blind spot, why ignoring global trends could cost your company millions. As I said, if you've got any questions, put them in the Q&A and we'll keep an eye on those. Before we get started, I just wanted to share what Government 365 does. So we work with owners, boards and executive teams to help you understand your blind spots, to help you grow through our innovative technology coupled with a hands-on approach to support you. As an example, I asked a group of directors and executives recently, how aligned are you on your strategic priorities? They all said very aligned. And when I asked each one of them to share with me the top 3 strategic priorities, I got about 30 different priorities. We helped them align on the 2 or 3 areas that would add the most value. One of the most misunderstood areas is what high-performance governance looks like. And in my last webinar, I asked Matt Fulbrook, what's the definition of governance? And his view is good governance is creating the conditions for better decisions to be made. So quite a simple and applicable to every business. So how do you make better decisions when the world's changing daily? So as many of you have experienced major turbulence during COVID and you thought that was coming to an end, well, along came Mr. Trump and turned things upside down. So who better to chat with about the implications for business and directors than someone who's been there before many times, the Honourable Tim Groser, best known for his role as Minister of Trade and Climate Change in the government of Sir John Key, serving from 2008 to 2015. He left Parliament in 2015, subsequently spent 3 years as New Zealand's ambassador to the United States. He's a renowned speaker on global trade issues. He is available for public speaking or consulting to your company. He's frequently consulted by academic and policy circles and is currently collaborating with Yale University on an upcoming book focused on international trade and the ongoing trade wars. So over the years, he's played a pivotal role in shaping New Zealand's trade policy, serving as New Zealand's ambassador to the World Trade Organization, chairing 2 of its most critical negotiation groups, rules groups responsible for technical negotiations on subsidies and anti-dumping measures, and agriculture negotiating group. He's also acted as New Zealand's chief negotiator in the Uruguay round, last successful multilateral trade negotiation. Additionally, he was instrumental in negotiating all 3 of New Zealand's free trade agreements with Chinese Economic Triangle, covering the direct customs territories of China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. So welcome, Tim. Fantastic to have you on the webinar.
Thank you very much, Jerry. So look, why don't I just start off with some general high-level statements, and then we'll just take it from there. I'm a great believer when I make presentations like this in sort of putting right at the start what I think is the most important takeaway that I'd like listeners to reflect on, and then backtrack from that into the analysis. So the big takeaway I'd suggest you draw from the current situation, as I see it, is stunningly obvious. We are facing a moving target, and the right business strategy in this situation is to be extremely conservative. It's as simple as that. So, I mean, a beautiful illustration of this, let's take one of these corporate behemoths, Apple. And right at the time when I think the Trump tariffs on China were a tiny, 125% rather than the 145 or whatever it is, they were talking about, given that 90% of iPhones are imported into the United States from China, about a huge shift of production into India, because the tariffs imposed or to be imposed on India were far lower than China, and Apple would have the capacity to expand its operation. Now, had they actually implemented that, it would have been a very foolish decision, because far better was high-powered lobbying of Trump to explain the political implications of US teenagers and everyone else paying $3,500 for an iPhone. And they got an exemption. Now, I don't think it's any different for a New Zealand SME. This is not a stable situation. So my overwhelming high-level advice, because everybody will have their own specific company to think about, is be very conservative, because there's no goddamn point in adjusting to something that can change radically in a matter of days. So that's sort of, Jerry, what I give as the bigger takeaway. I know it's very obvious, but people sometimes forget the obvious, right?
Yeah.
Now let's go ahead, please. Just interrupt me as we go, Jerry.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's good to have that helicopter view at the start, and then we'll get down into the weeds. So what's your take on where things are at currently?
Well, let's start with the facts as we know them before we start to try and interpret this. And when it comes to the interpretation of this extraordinary situation, I think it's useful to follow a methodology that Warren Buffett famously used when it's about time. He said, well, if you ask me what's going to happen to the S&P 500 in a week's time, I will answer you, I wouldn't have a clue. If you ask me where it might be in 3 to 6 months' time, I'd give you some tentative scenarios. If you ask me in 5 years' time, I'll be much, much clearer. So, and I think in a situation of uncertainty like this, it is useful to follow that Buffett concept of looking at the immediate issues we all face, and then the intermediate and longer term issues. And the longer term issues, they're sort of the really more fascinating questions, and they go well beyond international trade to international security as well, and the whole role of the United States in enforcing the liberal rules-based system, which is a much bigger issue than just international trade. But let's push that out and start with the facts. So the facts as we know them are that the baseline for all New Zealand exporting companies, and the United States has been a rapidly growing market for many of our folk in the last few years. It's just overtaken Australia as our second largest export market, distant behind China, but nevertheless doing very well, thank you very much. I think it's around 14% of New Zealand exports. The immediate situation we're all facing now is a 10% tariff. Now, it's a little higher than that because these 10% tariffs, which were a climb down from those absurd tariffs the president announced on so-called Liberation Day on the White House lawn. You remember, along with that ridiculous, bodgy econometric equation that Professor, quote, Pete, unquote, Navarro had invented for him. They were far higher than that, but they were immediately wiped down to 10% for the next 90 days, all right? So, and the 90 days expires from memory on the 9th of July. So I don't know what that is. It's probably about 70 days now or less away. Now that 10% is in addition to whatever rates your companies were having their exports imposed on. For example, with respect to one of our most important exports, lamb, there is a specific tariff rate. I negotiated it, believe it or not, 30 years ago at the end of the Uruguay round. Trivial tariffs of between, from memory, 2 or 3 cents up to about 1.8 or 2.8 cents per kilogram. So, I mean, frankly, it's as good as free trade, but there's a little bit of tariff there. The 10% is additional to that, all right? So you need to get your company people to do their calculations on this is the baseline. Now, there will be export companies from New Zealand who will pay higher than 10% because they will be subject to, well, there are several things they can be subject to. The first is, like the steel and aluminium tariffs imposed during the first Trump presidency when I was ambassador up there in Washington. We're not a bloody target, of course. We are what I've called in public comments collateral damage. No. They're after the big guys on, say, aluminium. And we get caught up in as the bullets ricochet. And I couldn't I couldn't do anything about it as the ambassador. So this time Trump will impose more of these sectoral tariffs, because what he really wants to do is to reshore domestic production in the United States. Now, at the moment, the proposal is insane. I want to reshore everything, right? That's not going to work. But I think there'll be a very strong political push behind similar higher tariff sectoral deals on the products that have already been announced. I'm not revealing any secrets here. They are steel and aluminium continuing. They are pharmaceuticals. They are semiconductors and auto parts. And there may be others. And don't rush to the conclusion that, so if you take auto parts, for instance, that, New Zealand doesn't export auto parts. Actually, that's wrong. There are one or two companies that export, from memory, largely to Mexico, certain products that are inputs into the giant North American supply chain. So this is still in flux. The president announced literally a few hours ago exemptions from these tariffs for auto parts, but I think it means exemptions for those parts that are manufactured in Canada, the US, and Mexico. It's not clear, but my general point is there are going to be higher tariffs than 10% on any exports that get caught up in these sectoral deals, like steel, aluminium, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, and so on and so forth. The next source of potentially higher tariff rates, although technically one shouldn't call them tariffs, they are other duties and charges in the technical WTO and GATT sense, are from what are called trade remedies. So what we have politically in the United States is a very permissive political atmosphere for protectionism. And here, New Zealand and Australia absolutely are the targets. It's not collateral damage in all cases. It may be on timber, collateral damage when it comes to anti-dumping duties on Canadian lumber imports. But in the case of some of our primary exports, Australia and New Zealand are the targets. And the lobbies that have successfully in the past approached the US government for what are called safeguard action against New Zealand sheep meat. Back about 20 years ago, I was deeply involved in that as an official, not as the minister. Lockwood Smith was the minister at the time. They're going to have a crack at us. So companies in our sort of primary sector heartland of our export sector are at risk of other duties and charges arising from anti-dumping duties, and most particularly security exception safeguards. Now, before people start making predictable but understandable jokes about how can a lamb chop affect the security of the United States, that is assuming there is rationality here. And I can assure you that rationality has got sweet FA to do with it. The reason why these lobbies are looking, and not just with respect to Australia and New Zealand, many other countries too, to use the security exceptions is because it's essentially non-judiciable, in the sense that unlike other trade remedies, where there are legal processes in the United States whereby very highly paid American trade lawyers can use the US legal system to argue against the imposition of these other duties and charges, like anti-dumping duties, for example. It's pointless doing this on duties that are imposed to protect the security of the United States, because there are no objective legal tests of what is related to the security of the United States. And if you read, as I have, the submission of the US lumber industry, arguing that lumber imports from Canada interfere with the national security of the United States. I mean, people like me, and I guess 99% of you listening, would just simply laugh when you read this BS. But you have to understand the politics behind it. This is the weapon of choice of these lobbies. In addition to the 10% tariffs, in addition to the sectoral tariff deals that our competitors in the American market are using because they've got a ready audience for it. So there's all these threats out here. And then the question is, well, we're meant to be living in a negotiating pause on these new and far higher tariffs. I'm still sticking, Jerry, to what are the facts facing our exporters before we get into the more intriguing questions about where the hell this is going, what does it mean politically? Technically, the absurd tariffs that were announced on Liberation Day on the White House lawn, I'm sure you all remember the famous charts of Trump holding up, pointing to these tariffs. They've been suspended by this, they're called reciprocal tariffs. And they've been suspended and replaced by this 10% tariff regime on everybody except China. I don't think that's wrong, even in detail. There might be one or two other exceptions, but that's the situation we face. With the so-called threat to reimpose them in 90 days, and that 90 days expires, as I said before, on the 9th of July, which is, I don't know, 70 days away now or something like that. Excuse me, just a glass of water. Now, in other words, what I'm saying to you is the current factual situation facing your company's exports, roughly speaking, 10% with the possibility of some higher rates. That technically could change on the 9th of July. Now, prudence would suggest to me that you write your export contracts with this theoretical possibility in mind. I'm not going to give you advice on how to write an export contract because I've never written a bloody export contract in my life. That's not what I've done for a living. But you guys, you know how to do this. Just be cautious, be conservative, keep in mind the possibility that if you do your calculations with respect to the competitiveness of your exports in a longer term, the situation may change radically. Well, but that's not so much for New Zealand because the so-called reciprocal tariffs were 10%, even though the calculation suggested it should have been 20% for New Zealand and 10% for the US. But somebody in USTR obviously said, oh, what a bloody waste of time. We'll just charge the Kiwis the same as we're charging the Australians. All I'm arguing is be conservative when you draft your forward contracts against the possibility that technically, after 9 July, when they have landed in the United States, you could, I suppose, face a different environment. Now, privately, my view that Trump is actually going to go back and impose those tariffs after the so-called negotiations have failed, as they will fail, is highly unlikely to be the case. And the reasoning then, I start now to get into politics, is because the reason he so quickly backtracked on those ludicrous tariffs, like what was the famous one, 50% on Nauru or something like that? I mean, just ridiculous.
Yeah.
Was because the bond markets started to discipline him. And the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, whom I met in the sense of shaking his hand and saying hello, when he went up a couple of months ago to Washington for the inauguration of the president at the invitation of some Trump insiders. I have a very good relationship with certain Trump inside lobbying companies who are not crazy MAGA people at all. He, being a Wall Street titan, he used to run George Soros's hedge fund operations, looked at what was happening in terms of international markets and the bond market, and obviously persuaded the president to back off. So why am I mentioning this history? Because if they sought to reimpose those higher tariffs on the 9th of July, exactly the same thing would unfold again. You know, remember the old story, I can't remember who it was, some famous, brilliant financial genius said when asked what if he were going to be reincarnated, what would he like to be reincarnated as? He said, I'd like to be reincarnated as the bond market because they discipline and have power over everybody. And some of you will remember the famous demise of Liz Truss, who lasted shorter time than the proverbial lettuce of 43 days because of the bond market. So capital markets are brutally non-political, and they would only impose a brutal reality check. So rationality, and I know there's limitations on using rationality in this current environment, would suggest they would be insane when it comes to 9 July to say, all right, well, New Zealand and everyone else hasn't agreed to what we demanded. We're going back to those reciprocal tariffs I announced on the White House lawn. Well, if they did that, just watch what would then unfold on currency and interest rate markets. So I'm assuming they wouldn't be that dumb. Now, where do we go from here? Well, first of all, how are so Trump has characterized these negotiations as everyone's lining up to kiss my ass. It's literally what he said on television. I'm sure many of you will have seen it. Well, what is actually happening is that every single one of those 70 countries, including our own, has done the only rational political thing that any government would do, which is to immediately indicate to their networks in the State Department, the Department of Commerce, and USTR that they would like to engage in discussions with the United States. I mean, what else would you do in a situation? It doesn't mean that they're lining up to capitulate, as the kiss my ass metaphor suggests. Now, New Zealand won't get their toe in the door in this process because we're just not the target, which doesn't protect us in any sense, because they'll just impose on a take it or leave it basis some type of discipline. But those countries that are big enough and have got some options to take a different strategy, we can already assess the results of the so-called negotiations. Let's deal with the biggest of them all, China. Their approach is, we're doing nothing. We're doing absolutely nothing. We'll just sit there and wait. And I'm absolutely convinced, I've had a lot of dealings with Chinese on global economic issues. I have a great deal of respect for them. I know several of the key players still in China. People that I negotiated, for example, the understandings that allowed me as the Minister of Trade to negotiate a comprehensive FTA with Chinese Taipei, the term we use for Taiwan in international trade. And they are playing a long game. What is absolutely clear is that they're prepared to take pain. They know there's going to be pain, but their narrative is about avoiding a repetition of what they call the century of humiliation, which is when the European imperial powers came up the Yangtze River to try and defend the British government's monopoly to sell opium to the Chinese people in southern China and imposed their will. That's why when we all go to Shanghai, this amazing city of today, we visit the French Quarter and the Italian Quarter and the American Quarter, and as the Brits, handed out to their imperial mates bits of China. They're not going to do that again. It's as simple as that. And the calculation of the Trump administration that China would be so hurt by this they'd capitulate is going to be proven woefully wrong. I'm like 99% certain of that. This does not mean that China will not, at the appropriate time, sit down and talk practically with the United States negotiators, but sure as hell isn't going to happen now. With respect to the other major countries that have engaged, the results are already pretty bloody plain. The Japanese, huge exporter, obviously, to the United States, with massive investments inside the United States. There are all manner of products, including autos. When the new Prime Minister came back and reported to the Diet, first of all, it was against the background of press chatter that many of you will have seen, which was along the lines, the Americans couldn't even tell us what they wanted us to do. Just repeat that. The Americans couldn't even tell us what they wanted us to actually do. And then in the formal statement to the Diet, the Prime Minister said, this is like only a week ago, I think, I do not believe it is in Japan's interest to make any significant concessions to the United States. This will be long and difficult. The European Union, an even bigger player, obviously, than Japan, their trade commissioner has got some unpronounceable Eastern European name, but effectively that's their trade minister for the whole of the EU. They had a meeting in Washington on, I think, the 21st of April. And how long did it last? 2 hours. 2 hours. Look, I've been a professional negotiator, as you know from the intro, for decades. 2 hours is enough time to introduce the members of the delegation, tell the person who comes in to ask what coffee you would like now to drink, and perhaps agree on a date for the next meeting. That's about all 2 hours can do. In other words, this is a farce. There are no negotiations going on. So, but what is not clear from the mass of commentaries that I'm reading, trying to keep up with this kaleidoscope of politics that keeps on changing, is what Trump is telling people like the CEOs of Walmart, Target, and Home Depot that called on him the other day to point out that if he continues down this track, there'll be shortages on the shelves and prices will skyrocket. It seems that he has said to these CEOs, oh, don't worry, we're going to get good deals out of this. And my concern, this is a private concern, which I can't give any evidence to back it up, is international trade is a very complicated thing. And highly intelligent people who've never been involved in it sometimes show the most striking lack of political understanding about these realities that I'm trying to share with you. So my concern is that they possibly believe this nonsense from the president. I don't know that. It's just that it's such a weird situation. You can see that there's not going to be a series of negotiations that will produce a success for the United States out of this. Now, what I think Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, clearly a highly sophisticated and intelligent man who, whose past, if you've read about what his views in the past were, he would have the same views about international trade that I do, and I suppose 95% of you people have, in favor of an open economy and competitive markets. I think it's clear what he is trying to do, which is reposition the United States as, let's get something agreed with our, quote, friends, allies, and partners, small and large, and that would include us, and then let's confront China together. That would bring the United States' strategic broad policy into conformity with what everybody, certainly including me, thought Trump was going to do. We never for a minute thought Trump would start with his first trade war with Canada and Mexico. Not for 1 minute did I read a single analysis that predicted that. We all thought it was going to be war with China, which is bad enough in itself. But the point I'm trying to make is my interpretation, and it's only an interpretation, I don't say this with enormous confidence, is that Scott Bessent is trying to get back to that position. But, as they say, it's a bloody sight harder to put toothpaste back inside the tube than to squeeze it out. So disruptive have these measures been on all of America's allies, starting with Canada, the whole election in Canada, which went the way of Prime Minister Carney, was a consequence of US trade policy. And Carney and others have been saying, there is no return. The new Chancellor of Germany is saying we need to deal with a materially different situation. So I don't think this recalibration of US strategy to settle deals with everyone else and then we'll all confront China together, I don't think that's going to work, that is my subjective view, as I say, not with the same degree of confidence that I made earlier statements, but I sense that's where it's heading. Now, look, I'm going
Yes.
to pause.
So the genie's out of the bottle, as you're saying, and it's not going back. If you come back down to New Zealand, and obviously, what you're saying is the government really aren't going to have a seat at the table. If you're sitting around a boardroom in New Zealand, and what I'm hearing from you is obviously be conservative, don't be rash in decision making. What blind spots do you think there are for people, for directors, that they should be aware of, or what should they be having conversations around?
Right. So we've had a quick, as the French say, tour d'horizon of the US scenario. But as we all understand, this has second round impacts on markets around the world. And the issues that CEOs need to be thinking about are, where could this move to? For example, in certain markets, the US will have been a very important destination for Chinese and other exporters. They will need a home. They will look for other markets. And you, company executives, need to be aware that the risks go broader than just the US market, because there'll be a lot of surplus product looking for a home. Now, actually, I've proposed, admittedly, to expert audiences, not political audiences, that the rest of the world should be looking at what I call a standstill commitment. In other words, to prevent beggar thy neighbor policies that were the consequence in the 1930s of the original Hoot, Smoot, Hawley tariff increases, which were a damn sight smaller, by the way, than the tariff increases the US put in place now. And what this led to was a cascading series of protectionist measures. So I'm not trying to scare the proverbial out of people. I'm just saying that the risks to your other exporters, they are real. And I think there should be a strong political focus on reinforcing a sense in the rest of the world to stand up to the political pressures. There will also be a serious risk of dumping going on, including in our own market. And the New Zealand government, and I'm sure they will, should be ready immediately to protect our own domestic market from unfair dumped competition if some of this stuff tries to find a home in the New Zealand market. And you company executives should be beating down the door of the government if you sense any signs that my judgment is wrong. I don't think my judgment will be wrong. I'm sure they will move expeditiously to deal with that when and if that threat emerges.
So with the surplus, there's also potentially opportunities as well. So if companies are getting rid of US products, I suppose it's looking at New Zealand companies who are competing with those US products. There's an opportunity there to fill that gap as well.
Absolutely. And in thinking about your point, Jerry, I've thought particularly about seafood. So I've forgotten now the data point, but I think we sell about 15 to 20% of our seafood exports to the United States. It's all high-end stuff, right? Now, here's the absurdity of Trump's decisions applied to seafood. According to the data that I've looked at when I made a presentation to the New Zealand Seafood Exporters thingy, whatever the association's called in Wellington, said over 80%. Actually, the administration has made a executive order subsequent to my own research saying it's over 90%. So it's somewhere between 80 and 90% of all seafood consumed in the United States is imported. 80 to 90%. Now, all of this is now facing, as we speak, a minimum of a 10% tariff. But in the case of China, which is the largest source of imports, and it's about a third of all imports, so roughly a little less than a third of all consumption of seafood in the United States comes out of China. Well, they can't export to the United States, one assumes, over a tariff of 145%. So what's going to happen to fish restaurants, to supermarkets when people want to buy fish? Well, I think it's bloody obvious. There's going to be an overwhelming shortage of fish because the US industry can't suddenly build new fishing fleets charge off to Chinese territorial waters and say to the Chinese, excuse me, but now that you're no longer exporting, can we now take the fish from your territorial waters and export them back to the United States? It's ridiculous. So I expect serious opportunities. First of all, it would seem to me simple Eco 101 logic that our seafood exporters will be able to pass on all of the 10% tariff in a situation where supply is deeply constrained. And I would expect prices to increase far higher than that. So paradoxically, just to give seafood, Jerry, as one of your as an example of your question, this could well work out to contain some opportunities down the line, assuming we're dealing with a stable situation. And that's where you have to come look back on this whole logical absurdity. This could end just like that. And the scenario that I outlined, which I think is logical, could just disappear with a simple proclamation. Oh, we're going to suspend for another 3 months the duties on all seafood imports. I think it takes you full circle also back to the key headline I wanted to put before your colleagues at the beginning of my presentation. Be bloody conservative and write every legal contract you allow your export managers to be written with this conservatism in mind.
Yeah. And if you take aside the US and the opportunities potentially in the US for goods, what about dealing with China? Because China's a big importer of New Zealand goods. So they're obviously going to be hurting. They'll have a lot of surplus probably in areas that are not necessarily products that get imported from New Zealand. But how should New Zealand be looking at the opportunities in China?
Well, this is a huge issue for us and Australia. Even larger for Australia than for us, but roughly 30% of our exports go to China, and the Chinese economy will take a hit. By the way, I'd like to come back to the overall macroeconomic situation, because this is something we haven't discussed and is extremely important to New Zealand companies. But let me just, before we get onto the macroeconomic situation, yes, China will take a hit from this. I'm certain that my political judgment will be right, that they're absolutely prepared to take a hit. They will never capitulate to the Americans on this. Will this result in a sharp downturn in the Chinese economy? Well, it's got to have some negative impact. But when you think about broadly, it'll differ, company by company, New Zealand export company by New Zealand export company. For example, I think it could get difficult for some of our timber exporters to the extent that they are exporting timber that will be used in the manufacture of, say, furniture by China, with export to the US in mind. But I think your high-level point, Jerry, is the bigger point and is the right point, that on things like dairy products, meat products, it's hard to see a sharp decline in demand arising out of this, because we are part of their food chain. So I hope that optimism isn't exaggerated, but I think other countries with more complicated export supply chains into China, I think they'll have a serious problem dealing with this. But my gut feeling is Australia, with its huge minerals exports, New Zealand with its huge primary exports, will probably have a negative impact, but I can't see it at this stage being catastrophic.
Yeah. Okay.
We go to the macroeconomic situation, because in the last few weeks, this to me is the big shift in analysis. So prior to the Trump administration, the US economy was doing incredibly well, actually, incredibly well. Productivity, total factor productivity in the United States over the last 10 years had sort of completely outstripped total factor productivity in Europe and in many of the Asian economies. And the US was in a good position, albeit with this very large and growing problem of debt, the fiscal debt, for which there is no political appetite whatsoever on the part of both of their, I'm sorry to say it, useless political parties to deal with, right? But what has clearly happened is that all the major forecasters in the United States. You know, the commercial people like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Chase, the biggest bank in the United States, all the official forecasters, they've all sharply increased their estimate of the danger of a recession, typically going from putting it as a sort of a 20%er to between 40 and 60. And a couple of days ago, one of the most respected economic forecasters, a company I don't really understand quite what they do, Apollo Asset Manager, but the chief economist for this company, who had been the chief economist for Deutsche Bank for 15 years. I mean, you don't get these positions unless you are top level modeler, right? He estimated a 90% probability of a recession. So who the hell knows precisely how to, put the odds on it? But I'd say two things. First of all, it's a small, slightly technical point. I don't think we should get obsessed with will there be a recession or not, as if this is some binary thing, yes or no. After all, a recession is defined as 2 negative quarters in a row. In other words, if US GDP would record 0.1% growth negative in 2 quarters, it's a recession. But if it recorded 0.1% positive 2 quarters in a row, it's not a recession. Well, I'm sorry. Look, this is a point on a number line. It would make no bloody difference at all whether it's 0.1 positive or 0.1 negative. What we are looking at overwhelmingly is a slowdown in economic growth in the United States. And the uncertainty caused by Trump's policies lies at the heart of that. So where is this going to go? Brings us back into overtly political calculations. What is 100% clear? Just read any of the literature coming out today in the United States on its first 100 days. It's all uniformly negative. I mean, apart from the hardcore MAGA with their red baseball hats on around the wrong way. I mean, Trump famously said, and he was 100% accurate many years ago, he said, I could walk down Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and it wouldn't affect my popularity with my base. And I think he was 100% right. So these people, they're off in some other la land. But elections are never defined by true believers. They're defined always by that vast 40 to 50% of voters in the middle. And all of Trump's political ratings have gone sharply negative from the optimism of his immediate election. He's now trailing, according to most of the polls, about -9% on the favorable, unfavorable syndrome. So the big question is, and your listeners on this seminar will be just as well equipped as me to make their own judgment, will this be sufficient to trigger a complete volte-face on Trump's part? Now, rationality would say, of course. But there is a very powerful caveat with that. Trump may be inconsistent, but he's not inconsistent on one issue alone, and that's trade and tariffs. He has been a complete believer in protectionism for 40 years. That's why he loves the man he calls my Peter, this mad professor of economics. And I've always said no country is complete without at least one mad professor of economics that none of the other professors of economics believe in for a minute, but he tells the politicians what they want to hear. So, rationality, of course he's going to pivot massively to save his presidency, except for this caveat. And I don't have any magic wand to tell me which way it's going to go, but I can tell you what, the pressure is going to mount and mount and mount.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I could listen for another hour, Jim. So I'm going to wrap it up there. So what I'm hearing is, basically there's no point doing scenario analysis in your boardrooms. It's really to be conservative. You've obviously got to wait and see. I think there could be opportunities that come out of this if you're aware of where US goods are going to, and you have the same goods that go to that country. There's opportunities there. I think there's a watch out for dumping of products in certain categories. So that's really being very watchful of that and reacting very quickly at home with our politicians on that one, because yeah, that could impact people massively. But yeah, I'm really hearing it's as I said to you before we started, it's a bit of a soap opera that people can't get their eyes away from. Hopefully, you know, we're in a better position where, but it's about being adaptive to what's happening and not being too reactive, which some companies are doing. So thanks very much, Tim. It's been great chatting to you. I'll just wrap up there. If anyone wants to know more about, have Tim on in terms of a conference, he's a professional speaker. He's also available if your company or board needs someone to consult with around these issues in much more detail. So you can reach out to him, and if anyone wants to come through me, I can give you his details. From a Government 365 point of view, if anyone wants to know more about Government 365 or to help you uncover your blind spots to drive faster growth, then contact me. Our next webinar is with Helen Van Orton. She's an expert on AI on the 28th of May at midday, entitled AI Friend, Foe or Free for All. So we'd love to have you join me again for that. In the meantime, have a great day and don't get too stressed, and just stay conservative, and let's hopefully watch this unfold in a good way, hopefully for us, and not like the American numbers of Donald Trump, which are heading south very fast. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks, Tim. It's been great having you on.